Thank you for being here on this lovely June day for History Café, a waterfront without Wobblies. And thank you to those of you who are tuning in via live stream as well. My name is Sora. I work here at MoHi and very excited to have you all. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. History Café as a series is presented in partnership with HistoryLink on the third Wednesday of every month. HistoryLink is a wonderful resource as the largest free online encyclopedia of Washington state history. If you need a restroom at any time during the night, they are just past the deli case on your left. A little run of show tonight. So we're going to start with a great moderated Q&A type discussion with the lovely Kiku from HistoryLink and Conor Casey, and then Conor will give a presentation followed by audience Q&A. As we ground in the space, it's important to recognize that here at MoHi, we are on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Suquamish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from this place with lasting impact on the land, water, and people. And therefore, it's crucial for us to hold deep respect and gratitude for their unbroken stewardship of this place. And therefore, we encourage you to learn more by visiting the websites of local tribes and visiting their cultural institutions to learn more about the people whose land you're on. To introduce tonight's speaker, Conor Casey is the founding labor archivist of the Labor Archives of Washington, the University of Washington Library's special collections. Casey first became interested in labor history through researching his grandfather's experience as a striking longshoreman during the 1934 Pacific Coast Maritime Strike. Conor is a many-time contributor and partner of MoHi, a fabulous historian, and we're lucky to work with him again tonight. And he will be joined by the lovely Kiku Hughes, who works at HistoryLink and is one of our invaluable partners. She's a lovely person, and yay, give them a warm welcome.
Thanks so much, Sora, and thanks to MoHi, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. So Conor, I wanted to start very broad because I think a lot of people, myself included, aren't super knowledgeable about labor history, how they formed, how they operate, the changes they've gone through. So could you define what is a labor union? And then maybe also highlight some of the key players in the Seattle waterfront labor scene.
Sure, yeah. So I guess some of the first models that we might be familiar with for the kind of labor union model might be the guild system, where there was kind of almost a certification of people that were in the trades that they turned out, and that was sort of a formation of like a standard and a quality control, as well as like sort of a labor monopoly. And then some of the ones in this country actually first formed as funeral associations or burial associations of mutual aid and grew out from that. So in fact, sometimes you look at early union ribbons that harken back to that, because when they would have the labor parade, one side of the ribbon would have their affiliation, and on the other side it would be black for when they would march for a fellow worker's funeral. And I think the way many of us think of it now is those who are collective bargaining agents for workers who have been recognized.
That's super interesting. I didn't know that it came out of a funeral arrangements. That's really interesting. And so we're talking today specifically about maritime unions. And Seattle, you know, we have a big maritime history. And maritime unions have often sort of been unique in the labor space. Can you talk about what makes maritime unions unique? And if there's anything specifically unique about Seattle's maritime unions that sort of differentiate them from the rest of the West Coast?
Sure, yeah. I think one interesting feature of maritime unions historically has been sort of the culture. I'm thinking particularly relating to sailors unions and longshore unions. There was kind of a fluidity, especially during their early history. Both of them started around the 1880s on the West Coast. And so there was a kind of mobility between sailors and longshore workers, sometimes sailors that went ashore as part of their life phase would then become longshore workers. And then there was also a connection here, and this is partly a really important Northwest story, with loggers in the timber industry. So they might work seasonal circuits. I think one other thing that's been pointed out by historians, or I guess a sociologist like Howard Kimmeldorf and Bruce Nelson, is that there was a really interesting aspect to the culture of both loggers and sailors, in that the place where they lived and worked were the same, right? So the loggers might work seasonally at lumber camps and were fairly isolated, but they would have this vast exchange of information and ideas through those migratory people that were also part of that labor circuit. So they'd debate ideas, they'd read, they'd talk about different political theories, and there was also no real buffer between the agents of their employers and themselves. So they probably came up with a different kind of class analysis as a result of that. That was also true of sailors. Sailors were often aboard ships for long hours. They certainly had to work hard and sometimes really had challenging conditions, but they'd read a lot and they'd talk a lot, and they had exposure to world ports and places that many people didn't see if they were not mobile. And as a result, they often had more of a cosmopolitan view and would sometimes come to more syndicalist or radical conclusions about organizing as a result of that. They also both had a lot of craft pride. I think that's one of the reasons why, despite the fact that there were external political entities that sought to influence both longshore and sailors, there was also a really strong sense of identity and internal organizational culture that had a really pragmatic bent about their own knowledge, about their own work and their own needs. So it wasn't as prone to just be completely bent to external organizers' needs too. And I think that when I think about that, that's kind of an interesting aspect of it. Of course, our proximity to the coast is really important, just as our proximity to extractive industries like fisheries and lumber and mining. That has been a defining factor for the Northwest, and for a good chunk of our history has resulted in an almost colonial relationship of extraction to eastern or places where things were being manufactured until fairly recently in our history.
Wow, yeah. And so we've talked a little bit about it, but maybe you could go through some just examples of maritime unions that have had a presence on the Seattle waterfront, just so people can understand the range of different groups that have been organizing there.
Sure, yeah. The Sailors Union of the Pacific, which has been affiliated with different international unions or different affiliations, has been there since the 1880s. First on sailing ships, and then on steamships, and then later on various other types of ships. The Longshore Union, which began as the West Coast branch of the International Longshoremen's Association in the 1880s, has been here since then. They evolved into the International Longshoremen's and Warehouseman Union, and then the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, dropping the gendered aspect of it in the 1930s as part of the evolution in the labor movement to comprise the Congress of Industrial Organizations and more of an industrial organizing model, which I'll cover in a moment. There's also unions for licensed crew members and officers, marine oilers and water tenders, other trades like shipyard workers, which played a significant role in the Seattle General Strike, which I'll go into detail in a bit. Maritime unions can also include things that are related to the maritime industry, so fishery people, fisher people, which also had unions. Some people are surprised to know. In fact, we still have some deep sea fisher unions here, as well as there were some historic ones that were allied fishery workers. And then there are also cannery workers, and then Marine Engineers Beneficial Association, and several other really important ones in the industry. Oh, and of course, we can't forget, we are the home of the International of the Inland Boatmen's Union of the Pacific, which represents all ferry boat worker employees and officers. Wow. I think it's officers too. Yeah, I could be wrong.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different players, and there've been a lot of change over the years of sort of who is organizing on the waterfront. And I wondered if you could talk briefly about sort of the socio-political environment that necessitated these changes in organizing strategies and changes in power on the waterfront, I guess.
Yeah, I think one thing that's kind of interesting, as I mentioned, the sort of information exchange and the fluidity, this really facilitated organizing in different eras. One particular example I'm thinking about is in the lead up to a major strike on the entire Pacific coast in 1934. The whole maritime industry, the workers in it were organizing together. So it wasn't just a longshore strike, although it began as a longshore strike. It involved sailors, it involved other unions that were affiliated. And one of the things the longshore workers did that formed a caucus to try to organize early was they created a mimeograph thing that they would store in the cargo of the ship. So as it worked its way up the coast, they'd have propaganda that they would give to their fellow workers. So that kind of facilitated the exchange. And did you say, I'm not sure if you mentioned technology, but I also think about the way in which, you know, with sailors and longshore workers, it was very skilled in how you would store cargo and move cargo from a ship. And there was a very face-to-face culture when they were working at break bulk cargo or hand-working cargo piece by piece. That was, you know, a big part of the craft of like stevedoring. As the advent of industrialization and technology continued, there was a shift to containerization. And that impacted, in some ways, the ability of that face-to-face culture to continue. But there were still continued modes and shifts in how people would continue to communicate and organize. I'm thinking about, and then of course, another really interesting aspect that sometimes people forget is that longshore workers and maritime workers were having success with these strikes and sometimes aiming for coast-wide contracts. Sometimes they'd severely disrupt ports or the whole industry. And they were getting organized. Well, the employers at some point got smart and they organized as well. And so there was this move and counter move, and so that was sort of an interesting evolution in the industry. One thing that longshore workers, but sailors also wanted, was a dispatch hall where they would be able to control the hiring and the dispatch of jobs, which was an important advent because before then, in the industries, they were ripe with grift and graft and crooked in-between agents. You'll notice that many of the unions I'm going to talk about had to do away with the labor contractor system. Very similar to a temp agency, actually, but we don't see it so sinisterly, or maybe not all of us do. But it's interesting because the dispatch hall allowed a trusted person that was a member of the union, often an elected officer, to distribute jobs. And as a result, the employers then contracted with the union for workers rather than there being a direct relationship, and it undermines some of the impetus for there being corruption and bribery that obtained, because before there was often this thing called the shape up where people would basically beg for jobs and they would intentionally create a surplus pool of labor. So that's another kind of example of an evolution.
Wow, yeah. So you've mentioned a few times of different maritime unions working together. I wonder if you could talk about how they worked together and when they were at odds, sort of how conflicts between these different unions played out.
Yeah, you'll notice that I'm going to address a little bit about, we talked about the a waterfront without Wobblies, which I love as a provocation, a great question about like what happened to some of the traditions as embodied by the industrial workers of the world, an attempt to organize workers on an industrial rather than a craft basis. This is a tension that you will see play out throughout the history of the waterfront. In these great contests in the 30s, people were able to overcome their craft distinctions and even their union divisions to work together to try to bargain. After the 34 strike, there was an attempt between about 1935 to about 1937, 8, 9 to create something called the Maritime Federation of the Pacific, which was an affiliation of the maritime unions to try to bargain together industrially and not just on a craft basis. I think you'll also notice that there is an attempt by some individual unions to organize on an industrial basis as embodied by the fact that some of them were foundational co-founders of the Congress of Industrial Organizations when it split off from the American Federation of Labor. So that was another model. It sort of workers that were workers of color, lower skilled workers, which I put in quotation because I don't think there's anything such thing as unskilled workers or whatever, but women, immigrants, people that were in mass production industries were often ignored by the American Federation of Labor. And this Committee for Industrial Organization began in 1935 within the AFL, who had long kind of avoided organizing folks like that, and split off to become a competing federation, which really embodied some of the values that have been advanced by the industrial workers of the world. So that tension you'll see continue through that history there.
Oh, wow, wow. And maybe you'll talk about this a little bit more in your presentation, but I wondered if there were any specific organizers, like human stories from maritime union history that really resonate with you or that you really appreciate.
Yeah, I think one person is Revels Caton, who worked as an organizer for the Marine Cooks and Stewards, black organizer from a storied family. His parent was a publisher, Caton's Weekly, a prominent black newspaper in Seattle. Really tried to advance the state of black workers, and then also joined the Communist Party and helped become an important leader down in San Francisco and in other places. So that, like a very principled organizer that basically, I think, really had the North Star of this person was civil rights and equal rights for black workers, and would advance the agenda within different parties or unions, but never lost sight of the fact that they wanted to improve the lot of their fellow workers that were marginalized. And within his lifetime, he really did see the lot of black workers, particularly, especially on longshore in the maritime industry, improve. Other really inspiring workers who gave the ultimate sacrifice include Jean Viernes and Silme Domingo, who were organizers for the cannery workers, who both opposed the Marcos regime in the Philippines and also were staunch advocates of internal union reform and corruption reform. And then lesser known folks that I'll talk about are some of the people that were the rank and file caucus and the reform caucus within the ship scalers union, who not only fought internal corruption and business unionism, but fought their mobbed up international union, and as a reward basically had their local killed, even though they weren't killed in the same way Domingo and Viernes were. So those, and then just, I don't know, pretty much everybody that I know that I've met or I've read about who's an organizer is inspiring in some other way. They're all heroes.
Yeah, and so my last question before we pivot, and not to get too political, but how do you think understanding labor history has helped us understand the current political moment? And I want to add as well that I know labor unions have really become sort of fighters right now in this moment for the rights of immigrants that are being detained, oftentimes, without charge. And we see it, here at the Northwest Detention Center. Labor unions are sort of organizing to around specific members who have been detained. So how do you think the history of labor can teach us about how to organize now in this political moment?
Yeah, shout out to SEIU 9 to 5 who helped organize to release some of our fellow workers. I'm a member of the UW Libraries Workers Union, so I agree with what you're saying. I think one thing to think about is sometimes you can understand a situation by seeing what the forces that are being arraigned against it are. So when you have an extremely right-wing political formation, what they want is quiescent, unorganized workers that they can exploit like commodities, and they want to villainize immigrant workers, right? But it's part of their larger power grab, which is to basically control everything and make people compliant. So I don't think it's a coincidence that most union workers now, the majority of the labor movement, are workers of color, and there's a lot of women in the workforce. That's what our labor movement looks like now. I'm going to talk about some of these unions that were less workers of color, less women, that has really evolved over time. And the current labor movement really is workers of color and a lot of women. And that's another reason why they're fighting to repel these attacks on their fellow workers. I think we also understand that the attacks on the immigrant community are only one category of difference that are going to be weaponized to try to suppress people. And it's a slippery slope. I'll talk a little bit about an attempt to deport Filipino nationals who were also in the U.S. legally, that had their status intentionally changed, not because of any criminality, but because they were very effective union organizers, and see this conflation of this intersectionality as a really important point of analysis.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Conor. That's all for my questions. We'll take audience questions at the end of Conor's presentation. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put my little timer on so I don't talk too long. I got very enthusiastic, as you can imagine, so I have like pages of notes, but I'll try not to go too long. I want to really thank both MoHi and HistoryLink for having me, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's an absolute honor to be able to talk about this history. As the head of the Labor Archives of Washington, it is really amazing to think about being the steward of these history, because I'm only temporarily keeping these stories, and I have the honor of being them. They're not my stories, and I don't own them. I'm only the conveyor of them. And sort of to that point, I want to make the point that there are people in these communities and these unions that are alive, that are the knowledge bearers, and they have produced books and scholarship and documentaries about this. So I can tell you mostly about the records, and I'm lucky enough to have done exhibits and work with the communities about it. But most of the stuff I know is because people have taught me, right? So that's my position within this. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about my shop, the Labor Archives of Washington. I'm going to talk about some of the history and events, and one of the things I tried to do was tie it into the actual geography of the waterfront, because I think it's pretty cool in a city that is continually reinventing itself to walk by places and know where something used to be. And then I'll talk about those as sites of resistance and rebellion, and then we'll do a Q&A, and hopefully I can try to cover how you can learn more about this yourself, because many of these resources are online. You can check them out of your library. You can see them streaming. In fact, if this is on the Seattle channel, there's a documentary about cannery workers unionism that's streaming there that's excellent, called One Generation's Time. So I kind of mentioned this. These are some of the sources that you can look into. There's supplementary information that you can look at if you're interested. And my reference tools tend to be finding aids and collection guides, exhibits and resources, which you can all find online. There's that link slide at the front of this presentation with the QR code that I can cycle back to if you want to look it up yourself later. So the Labor Archives of Washington is a community archives that was founded in 2010 as a partnership between the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies on UW's campus and UW Library Special Collections. We're really here to collect and amplify and promote the stories of workers in the Pacific Northwest, and that includes both organized labor as well as other workers. As we shall see, some of these stories are people fighting to reform the organized labor movement when it was exclusionary, but those are no less worker struggles, right? And we are free, we're open to the public, and we're really here to be a public hub for research. Sometimes folks are surprised that you don't have to be faculty or a student at the University of Washington, but that's why we're here. And you can come visit us. In fact, Special Collections is a really cool service where you can make online appointments and zoom in and look at their collections without even having to come in person if you don't want to. Our whole scope really goes all the way back to 1882 to the present. That means that we are generating new oral history collections as well as crawling websites and social media so that we really capture the now as well as the historic collections, and we are processing and preserving them as well as digitizing historic collections. Our geographic scope is the whole Pacific Northwest, not just Washington. And because of the story of migratory labor circuits and diaspora immigrant populations that often were people that were workers in different industries, we have a much bigger scope than you might anticipate. You know, it includes Western Canada, we have ties to the Philippines, the whole Pacific slope, and Latine migratory workers circuits. So it's bigger than one might anticipate. So people use these collections for a variety of different types of disciplines. It's not just labor. People have used it in a lot of different treatments, and I'm always learning from researchers who are teaching me what they found. This is sort of our organizing model. The idea is basically that we have a holistic approach, that if you look at a area, both geographically or topically, and it isn't reflective of the full diversity of the people in that scope, as in the Pacific Northwest has always been highly diverse in terms of its working population. If you only have collections that reflect native, male, white workers and organized unions, or it's only the officers from those unions, you've got a problem, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean they're always the inevitable home for every one of those stories. Sometimes they belong with the communities in different ways. It's just that if people do want to house their things there, we try to proactively work on that, but we also try to prioritize how we do outreach, how we digitize, how we process from an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens, so that the collections and the projects that result from the collections become increasingly more representative of what the working classes usually look like in this area. So this is just some of the features of it. The idea is that basically it's holistic. We try to be proactive. We try to be ongoing and collaborative. We create reciprocal relationships with communities of donors instead of transactional ones. So we're not just saying, oh, we've got the collections now, thanks for your history. We're trying to create ongoing things that might manifest in exhibits or oral history projects or cultural events or centennials and things like that. Trying to remain in community instead of just taking the collections. Our range is pretty broad. It includes everything from oral histories to flyers and picket signs. And as I mentioned, the scope is organized labor as well as social justice and civil rights movements. And we often partner with different unions directly for both digital humanities projects and oral history projects. We often do our outreach partnerships for events or exhibits and get input on our exhibits and have joint programs. We are also really lucky to benefit from more than 170 volunteers and student workers who have been with us since the winter of 2011. So it's really important to acknowledge that this is extremely labor intensive and expensive. And at a time when we just faced a large budget cut, all the more reason to acknowledge how expensive and important their work has been. We also have a social media program. Feel free to follow us. We really try to both emphasize the history and strengths of our collections, but also some of the lesser known stories. And that's what I've chosen to do here tonight. Rather than focus on two areas that are often told, which are longshore labor and sailors or maritime labor in that way, I tried to emphasize several stories that I feel aren't as told as an outreach of that, because it's the other story is amazing and sensational, but it is often studied. There's many books and publications and documentaries about it, and some of these aren't as known. And then we do offer direct services, which include a regional labor record survey, trying to understand the scope in all different types of repositories, historical societies, other archives, other museums in this area. We offer records management workshops and consultations for unions and other organizations, help with historical research, and then we also sometimes do exhibits and oral history projects with jointly with other organizations. I highlighted, this is a radio segment that we had on this We Do the Work radio show. It's called Learn Yourself, and it really does similar to this presentation. It either has a researcher or people from the community talking about their history when possible, and I mostly talk about how you can research more if you want. I highlighted all the ones that were related to some of the topics that I'm going to be talking to tonight. And then we did have a brief television segment. Was distributed. You can find it online. So if you're interested in any of these stories, some of these emphasize these same stories. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the industrial workers of the world, since that was sort of the framing provocation at the beginning of this program. So this is the organizing model of the industrial workers of the world. It was born in 1905 as a radical alternative to mainstream unions. Their motto: an injury to one is an injury to all. Unlike other unions, they welcomed every worker, immigrants, women, people of color, and unskilled laborers, no exclusions. The industrial model we're looking at, see those spokes radiating out? This wheel, also known as the Wheel of Fortune, shows their revolutionary industrial organizing model. Each one of these spokes is an industrial department that represents the organization of an entire industry. So this is their social ambition. They don't want to divide workers by trade like carpentry or railroads. They want to unite all workers in an industry, right? And the idea is to build power against the whole capitalist system, not just one boss. See those sections in bold?
They reflect the IWW's direct action tactics, strikes, slowdowns, and workplace sabotage. They openly criticize craft unions like the American Federation of Labor, those affiliated with them, the trades, for being too cozy with capitalism. And their leaders were often socialists and anarchists who aimed for one thing, which was basically to overthrow the capitalist system entirely. One of their modes was free speech fights. And finally, notice the edge of the wheel holding it all together. That's sort of the IWW's relentless activism. When cities banned street protests, they launched free speech fights. Members would swarm jails until systems collapsed. They'd demand individual trials. They'd stamp their feet together. They'd stream in on railroads to overwhelm the system, to demand free speech, right? And they didn't just ask for rights, they organized to take them back. This wheel isn't a game of chance, it was a blueprint for revolutionary social change. And though the IWW's power faded, their fight for universal worker solidarity lives on today and still exists. Oh, they still exist as an organization. People often talk about them as if they ceased to exist after the 1920s, and while they took major hits, there was a resurgence, and there's still a Seattle IWW branch here today, as well as in many other cities around and internationally. So this silent agitator stickerette, these tiny stickers were small enough to fit in a worker's pocket and onto the wall of a workplace or a manager's back. They're potentially revolutionary weapons. They were posted on boxcars, at mine timbers, and factory gates, and they basically whispered rebellion across the Northwest. They're called silent agitators, and they're alongside bold actions like the Everett Massacre. They define the IWW's fight for worker power. You'll notice here below the IWW Marine Transport Center Worker Charter from 1917. It really shows their ambition. So their one big union philosophy was to reject fragmented craft unions. And in this charter, you can see that they're trying to organize an industrial union in the maritime transport industry. So in other words, from sailors to deckhands, no exclusions based on race, skill, or immigration status. And they basically said, you know, solidarity takes the whole works. Now, one aspect about this that's important to know, and this is how they are both able to influence the policies and evolution of existing craft unions, but also sometimes organize independent unions, was dual card flexibility. So the IWW pragmatically allowed dual card membership, as in you can be an IWW member and card carrier, but also be a member of a craft union. Many observers thought that the actions of the International Longshoremen's Association, the stevedoring union, in the time of the Seattle General Strike, as well as the shipyard workers unions around that time in 1919, was heavily influenced by the IWW, because many of those folks had been fresh off the timber strike, and I mentioned that fluidity of labor divisions and between the loggers and other areas and sectors. So many people might have been members and might have still been card-carrying members, especially after some of the leadership was attacked severely in 1917. So just some of the flashpoints were, you know, there was a big free speech fight that grew out of an attempt to get rid of labor contractors in Spokane, 1909 to 1910. Wobblies flooded the city. 103 were arrested in one day. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn chained herself to a post, and others packed jails until the city surrendered. The Everett Massacre of 1916, where 300 Wobblies sailed to support a shingle weavers strike, which was AFL local. There was a sheriff who sent out vigilantes to the dock. They fired on them, and 5 Wobblies and 2 deputies lay dead. Untold other Wobblies were probably underneath the water. It was called Bloody Sunday. There were big lumber industry strikes in 1916 and 1917 where IWW-led loggers paralyzed the Northwest. They demanded 8-hour days and 4-hour minimum wages. Bosses hired replacement workers, scabs, and then actually called in a division of the Army to be basically what's known as a company union or a yellow card union, to undermine their ability to strike. But they actually gave the people that were from the Army basically the conditions that the strikers had demanded, because it was such a terrible, they called them timber beasts. It was such a terrible, working conditions and living conditions in those lumber camps. And then the Centralia tragedy in 1919, on Armistice Day, Legionnaires raided an IWW hall. Gunfire erupted. 4 wound up dead. The Wesley Everest was lynched at night. And so state vigilantes here partnered to crush labor. So this was sort of more of the stickerette, but just the idea that it's propaganda by the deed. Many IWW artists like Ralph Chaplin and other cartoonists designed many of these. They were meant to be distributed. They reached hobo jungles and factory gates. A dozen more appeared every time they would scrape one off. The charter symbolizes IWW's global reach. The enduring influence of the Wobblies, even after the 1917 raids on their leadership as part of the Espionage Act, a federal government act that tried to suppress free speech that was against World War I. Many of the leaders wound up being imprisoned or had to flee. Now, the IWW, even though they basically lopped the head off around 1917 to 1919, that model inspired sit-down strikes in the 1930s and some of the militant tactics of today's militant unions. So basically their lesson was to agitate everywhere in unions, the streets, and silent spaces. Now, the IWW's peak was really at its zenith around 1917. They swelled to an estimated 150,000 workers worldwide. Their one big union spanned continents, from Seattle dock workers to Australian miners, Canadian lumberjacks to British factory hands. The charter isn't just a document, it was a blueprint for global worker revolution or evolution. But their power terrified social elites. Their propaganda and rhetoric scared them. And so as they spread, so did the backlash, and governments moved to crush the IWW's radical anarchist and socialist foundations in their goals. So once again, in 1917, Espionage and Sedition Acts are passed, jailed Wobblies for speaking out against the war or for disloyalty. Canada outlawed them entirely in 1918. There were also criminal syndicalism acts in many West Coast states before then. In 1919, in America's first Red Scare, it saw raids and beatings and deportations and what's known as the Palmer Raids, and vigilantes also lynched IWW members like Wesley Everest and Centralia. So in the 1920s, membership plummeted. Even as their numbers dwindled, the second Red Scare in the 1950s, also used to attack communists, socialists, and other dissenters, ensured that the attacks basically never stopped. By the 1920s, the IWW was a shadow of its former self, but these artifacts tell the deeper story that the charter shows how far they reached, the stickerette, how stubbornly they resisted. Their dream, worker solidarity without borders, outlived every crackdown. And so this is one interesting kind of examination here. It's about the IWW's enduring institutional legacy. Did I show you that? See, sorry, I should mention this here. So like, an injury to one is an injury to all. Now that's a variation of something that was started before, but the IWW specifically used that phrase, right? And then in 1937, the Longshore Union takes that as their motto. That's not a coincidence. So it really embodied a whole philosophy that solidarity between workers, regardless of those different divisions that the bosses place between them, it's seared into labor's DNA. It basically meant no worker would be left behind, no divisions by race, skill, or gender. And though the IWW faded, this idea ignited the 20th century's greatest labor victories. So one of the weapons that the IWW advocated for was called the general strike, which is when all workers in a geographic location or a country all withhold their labor at once. So when shipyard and union workers in Seattle, 1919, struck, streetcar drivers in Winnipeg, 1919, maritime workers in San Francisco in 1934, they shut down entire cities. They used the IWS playbook. Minneapolis truckers in 1934, Oakland workers in 1946 proved it wasn't nostalgia, it was power. The IWW taught labor, paralyze the machine, and that demonstration of power can change the rules. So, their deepest impact might have been in shattering the old union model. While craft unions organized only elite tradespeople, the IWW united every worker in an industry, especially those ignored. Immigrants on assembly lines, black steel workers, women on textile mills. By 1935, even a committee in the conservative American Federation of Labor adopted their vision, forming the Committee for Industrial Organization and the CIO, right? But what happened next was a tidal wave. The CIO exploded, organizing auto plants, steel mills, and packing houses. In 1937, it split from the American Federation of Labor, becoming labor's militant heart. By 1955, when the AFL and CIO merged back again, the one big union dream kind of lived on in that industrial organizing model. It was a key part of the IWW's model. Emphasis on inclusive membership and industrial organizing then became institutionalized, even if the AFL-CIO did believe in contracts, and there still were many craft unions. So when you see this phrase today on picket signs or in union halls or in movement art, remember this origin. The IWW didn't just say these words, they built a movement that pushed mainstream labor to adopt this idea. Their charters may fade, their stickers may appeal, but the principle of solidarity remains in labor's enduring foundation. So let's begin with what's before us. I mentioned the ILWU's official slogan. It's a direct inheritance from the industrial workers of the world, and that isn't a coincidence. It's documented. It's a direct ideological kind of transmission. To understand how this happened, we look to 1919. That year, maritime workers across the Pacific Northwest, many IWW-aligned, attempted a regional rebellion. The ILA longshore locals were involved in the Seattle General Strike. They also were involved in a coast-wide 1919 longshore strike. They demanded a unified coast-wide contract, and they also crucially had one of their demands as union seats on the employer industry board. They were unsuccessful. That strike was crushed, but this established a playbook that the ILWU would later try to perfect in 1934. As sociologist Howard Kimmeldorf notes in Reds or Rackets, the ILA's, later the ILWU's, operational DNA kind of reflected these core IWW principles: rank and file control, militant solidarity, a resistance to union bureaucracy, and crucially, industrial unionism, although that dream was fleeting for the ILWU. This wasn't an abstract influence, it was a structural adoption. Harry Bridges, the founding president of the ILWU, was a former sailor and IWW member before coming ashore in 1920. His leadership directly translated wobbly tactics like the Marine Federation coalition with sailors in the 1930s into an institutional strategy. Ultimately, that federation failed because of internal politics and differences of personality. But it's also worth noting that Bridges was the West Coast head of the Congress of Industrial Organizations before his union was expelled for refusing to participate in the second Red Scare, sign loyalty oaths, and perform purges on leftists in their ranks. That meant that many workers from other unions that had gotten purged or kicked out of the CIO would find refuge often in ILWU locals. Many purged sailors wound up working in the ILWU after because of a screening program that got rid of their security clearance. So why does this happen in the Pacific Northwest? Well, scholars like Kimmeldorf and Nelson, I mentioned this, identify this unique labor geography where there's transient workers moving seasonally between logging, docking, and ships. That mobility created radical networks where the IWW and other radical ideas circulated organically. And so ideas that related to syndicalism, of course, these weren't solely owned by the IWW, but they were the most prevalent purveyor of them during that period. So when you see that slogan today, we're seeing more than just words. We're observing rhetorical continuity, the phrase itself, strategic implementation, as in coast-wide bargaining and attempts at industrial organizing, and the biographical transfer through figures like Bridges and many of the members of the ILWU and some sailors union people. So the IWW's decline didn't erase its legacy. It embedded that legacy in some of the institutions that followed. With that, I'm going to... Oh yeah, I should also mention one other aspect is that there were, to those personnel pathways, post-1920, many IWW members joined the Communist Party USA, which was founded in 1919-1920. So Kimmeldorf's oral histories confirm that these individuals often carried operational methodology like strike tactics, direct democracy practices into that 1930s maritime organizing. This wasn't a theoretical influence, it was embodied knowledge transfer from their experience from the 19-teens, right? And the heyday of the IWW organizing. Second, in terms of strategic adaptation, the CPUSA also pushed dual unionism at one time. It created a parallel radical unions for a time where it tried to create industrial unions that were communist, some said fronts, Communist Party inspired unions that were competing with some of the AFL unions at the time. But post 1935, there was a shift to a popular front strategy. So they moved towards infiltrating or influencing existing trades unions. The ILA, the ILWU became a primary vessel for this approach precisely because of its receptiveness to IWW and CPS USA trained organizers. However, it's really important to think about the strong occupational culture and organizers from within their ranks of the longshore workers. Their goals may have aligned with external organizers at times, but it would be a mistake to say that the ILWU or Sailors Union, the Pacific, were controlled by external organizers. Longshore workers and sailors were too canny and stubborn for that. So third, there was a differential receptivity. Not all unions equally embraced this legacy. The Sailors Union of the Pacific maintained a more conservative political culture resistant to dual unionism. The ILWU, particularly under Harry Bridges, himself, as I mentioned, a former IWW member, embodied some of these radical traditions, but was an advocate of rank-and-file union democracy, which allowed for a complex range of political orientations within the international and local unions. So the slogan we saw there operates on multiple levels as an artifact of direct ideological lineage, as an indicator of successful radical enculturation, and as evidence of varying organizational permeability to leftist traditions. So these were just some of the things I was thinking about in terms of some of the features of the continuity. The influence or limited influence of radicalism, aspects of civil rights unionism that emerged and rights consciousness, militants, the willing of militants and direct action, which is a feature of syndicalism, and also some of that militant wave of CIO and other subsequent unionism. Solidarity across craft or union lines, industrial organizing models, mobilizing workers of color, and we should add women and immigrant workers, which are all features that the IWW first advocated and were then embodied by the great strike and organizing waves of the CIO. I think the other thing you'll notice in these three case studies I'm going to cover, which really makes it a Seattle and a Pacific Northwest story, I think, is this tension of these regional rebellions that happen with the local unions, the local instantiations of international unions, pushing back against their international leadership when it doesn't seem to serve the local instances of the workers and their lived knowledge. They don't care if some people on the East Coast are telling them to shut up in their efforts to reform. And I think that is really a continuity, but it may be a feature of the Pacific Northwest too, the relative isolation that we've had historically. So that's an interesting thing that I think you'll see in some of these contests. And then there also seems to be a resistance to union bureaucracy in many of these stories, and also a rebellion against attempts of government suppression or government meddling within a collective bargaining process. So this one actually orients what may be a familiar story to y'all about the Seattle General Strike, but reminds us that this really started in the maritime industry and in the shipyards, right? So this great story that we often define ourselves from in this city actually has this maritime origin. So let's set the historical stage. Seattle kind of began as a classic or adjacent company town in the American West. Its economy mostly focused on extractive industries. So picture its foundations: massive lumber mills processing northwest forests, loggers working seasonally to harvest timber in those forests, a bustling port shipping raw materials east or to the rest of the world, fishing fleets harvesting vast resources of fish, maritime life, marine life, from coastal waters. And then mining operations scattered throughout the region that were extracting things. Sorry, y'all. I gotta ignore this call on my phone. It's from Centralia, appropriately. So then let's think about this. There's this kind of colonial relationship. Many Western U.S. historians look at this as a defining principle of the early history of the American West. Seattle, like the American West, often served the East Coast, sending raw resources out while importing finished goods and capital. Profits flowed to financiers in New York or the East, not locals, oftentimes. And locals were often forced to buy finished products, right? And then the other thing was, at some points, the extraction of those resources required capital, which didn't necessarily come locally sometimes. So once again, another kind of colonial relationship that is often recapped with developing nations and what we call first world nations now. We also, for a very long part of our history, up until about the 1950s or so, had a migratory labor force. And of course, we all know that there still is important sectors of the migratory labor force, including people that are in farm work. The work tended to be seasonal and transient. If you're interested in seeing kind of a photo essay of this, a really interesting work called Hard Traveling by Carlos Schwantes, a historian, that kind of notes that these Western cities were almost like islands upon the land that forced workers to ride the rails or travel in some other way to be able to go to these far-flung labor landscapes and locations. So loggers and miners and cannery workers followed jobs across different territories, across borders. There wasn't much job security. They had sometimes not very permanent roots, right? And then Seattle was also an isolated urban hub, a rare anchor in a sparsely settled region. Towns bombed near mines or mills often happened and then busted when resources went dry. So there's this boom-bust cycle. There was a perennial boom-bust whiplash as those commodities that were extracted, entire communities rose or collapsed with commodity prices, timber, gold, salmon. So stability was only an aspiration in this context. So this volatile, resource-driven basis shaped Seattle long before it grew into a city that we know today. And of course, now the economy is totally not volatile and very standard, right? No boom-bust cycles here now. The other thing to think about is really the role of war building up in the American West, but also Seattle itself. This ship isn't just steel, it's a symbol of Seattle's explosive transformation during World War I. The war ignited an economic supernova. Shipbuilding went into hyperdrive. The Seattle shipyards exploded from 16,000 workers in 1918 to 30,000 in 1919, almost doubling in 1 year. By the war's end, 26% of all U.S. ships were built here. Seattle's population surged. Seattle grew 32.9% in a decade. 1910, 239,000 about. 1920, 315,000. It was flooded by young male workers, and the gender gap narrowed dramatically. 136 men per 100 women, so 1910, and 113.5 to 1920. Labor also found its voice. Union membership skyrocketed by 400% between 1915 and 1918. Workers organized against stagnant wages and soaring rents. If that sounds familiar, the boom created the exact pressures Seattle faces today. Housing crisis, as in skyrocketing rents. Infrastructure strain, transportation was overwhelmed. Wage gaps, pay failing the cost of living. Rapid demographic change. Even the diversity parallels resonate. While still the majority white, communities like black residents, 2,874, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, and Jewish families began shaping central Seattle, laying the groundwork for the city we now know. World War I didn't just build ships, it helped build modern Seattle. And this is a variation of that whole industrial wheel of organizing. So once again, a blueprint from industrial rebellion that helped influence Seattle's labor soul. Now, The establishment, the AFL Seattle Labor Council, was formed in 1905. It aimed to unite craft unions under one citywide voice, but its ambition made it a thorn in the AFL's side because they were demanding regional autonomy from national control. This is going to be a familiar story that we'll see in some of the other stories. So even the AFL Central Labor Council in Seattle in 1919 was trying to do regional autonomy, and we'll notice that some of the component unions, the most important unions, are trying to bargain on an industrial basis, one that is strictly disavowed by the American Federation of Labor, their parent federation. Then we look, the IWW. The Seattle was IWW's heartland, one of many. The Industrial Worker newspaper was published here. When the 1917 timber strikes failed, hundreds of Wobblies flooded the shipyards, bringing militant industrial unionism to the waterfront. The Metal Trades Council of Seattle, the shipyard workers hacked the system. They formed the Metal Trades Council, a de facto industrial union. This loophole, as I mentioned, defied AFL craft separation by uniting welders, riveters, and machinists against bosses. But labor's unity had some brutal limits. I think it's still on this slide. Japanese workers were forced to build parallel power. By 1906, the Nihonjin Rodo Kumai had 600 plus members. The Japanese Labor Association and trade associations sustained their community. Crucially, they would back the general strike in solidarity when others hesitated, even though they were excluded from membership from the Labor Council on account of their race. Women also organized fiercely. Waitresses, laundry workers, and telephone operators were unionized, yet were often sidelined. Black workers faced near total exclusion from many AFL unions, except on the docks. The ILA chose to organize black workers who had been branded as strikebreakers in 1916, seeing the writing on the wall that this would just be used by the employers to divide them. But even though leadership would be black in the future, they still sometimes faced discriminatory practices within those unions, though they could be members. There were some important leaders that would emerge later. Seattle's labor movement wasn't one fight, it was a complex organizational ecology. Craft versus industry, reform versus revolution, inclusion versus exclusion would explode in 19... That Metal Trades Council, they ditched siloed unions. Welders, riveters, machinists bargained together as one industrial force. Boilermakers and machinists pushed the hardest. Their militancies infected this Central Labor Council. This wasn't just innovation, it was direct confrontation with AFL policy. So what did they do when the AFL pushed back? They leaned into their radical network. They appealed to the Seattle Central Labor Council. They mobilized citywide solidarity across They faced them all. Seattle's labor movement stopped asking for permission. So this wartime context. Wartime turned shipyards into pressure cookers. The government seized control. They regulated every bolt in shipbuilding. They froze wages nationwide. Many AFL unions took a no strike pledge during the war, and the bosses demanded it. So there was government-imposed wage freezes. There was a promise that they would then bargain after the war was over and that they would restore wages. In Seattle, workers were suffocating. Rents, as I mentioned, doubled almost overnight. Streetcars overflowed. 2-hour commutes became normal. Grocery bills devoured paychecks. And the cruel irony was that they built victory ships while starving in victory gardens. Seattle's shipyard workers faced an impossible choice: to keep their patriotic pledge or demand wages to survive in a city where living costs outraced their frozen pay. January 21st, 1919, 35,000 Seattle shipyard workers walked out on strike. Here's why those tensions exploded. I mentioned the wartime wage freeze, which trapped workers in rents and food costs as they skyrocketed at 300%. There was a U.S. shipping board, the Macy Board, created in 1917, which promised post-war raises and then stalled for 18 months. The breaking point was when Charles Pies, or Piez, I've never been able to figure out how to pronounce it, the director of that EFC, threatened shipyard owners: if you negotiate with workers, we'll cut your steel supply. But as a critical error, his telegram went to the Workers' Metal Trades Council, not the Bosses Metal Trades Association. So that misdirect in the telegram proved everything. The government sided with the bosses, and their promises were empty. So direct action was left with the only path. On January 21st, Skinner and Eddy workers dropped tools near today's T-Mobile Park. By noon, 45,000 workers from Seattle and Tacoma shut down every shipyard. Their demands were simple: bargain directly with the employers that they wanted to, right? No more Macy Board intervening and stalling a government entity. They wanted wages that matched survival costs. So this ground was set for a strike, but not just for an individual strike, but one that would make history. February 6, 1919, Seattle held its breath. For 5 historic days, the city didn't just strike, it was transformed. How? Through meticulous self-rule. A general strike committee issued passes for essential work like hospitals and milk deliveries. 35 neighborhood kitchens mobilized under one banner: Labor will feed the people. War veteran guards from Labor patrolled the streets. White armbands, no weapons, keeping the peace. Labor policed itself. The result was eerie silence. People stayed home. There were 0 arrests, 0 violence, 0 chaos. Even the Seattle Times grudgingly admitted it was the quiet of a small village. Workers didn't just withdraw labor, they built a parallel society for almost a week. City Hall went quiet. Labor halls became mini capitals. For 5 days, workers superseded the state, proving a city could run on solidarity, not coercion. But empires don't surrender power lightly. On February 6, 1919, 65,000 workers, those affiliated with the 110 different local unions that were affiliated with the Seattle Labor Council, shut down Seattle. I think I already mentioned this. So one of the things we did when we did a strike on the, when we did an exhibit on the general strike, was to sort of build a different relational map so that people could understand the proportionality of this. This isn't in direct proportion, but there were 35,000 shipyard workers and strikers of 65,000 labor union represented workers in Seattle. And then when you counted all the other ones, that's 20% of Seattle's population at the time. But then when you think of other labor organizations like the Japanese Labor Association and the IWW members, that's even more. And then when you think that these folks are often earners within families where people are doing domestic or reproductive labor and working in solidarity to support the strike, but not necessarily conceived of as union members, it's even bigger. So you can see these concentric levels of involvement, which was why they were able to shut down the whole city. What was the state's reaction to this largely peaceful phenomenon? Fear-mongering. While workers maintained perfect order, the state launched a propaganda war. Mayor Ole Hansen screamed that there was revolution in the headlines. Newspapers printed hysterical claims of a Bolshevik takeover. You got to remember that the Russian Revolution was fairly recent then. The Chamber of Commerce demanded blood. Ole Hansen's bluff, he threatened martial law while secretly begging for federal troops. Washington, D.C. responded, sending in 1,000 soldiers deployed to Seattle, 6,000 vigilantes hastily deputized with badges and guns. This may sound familiar. The irony, strikers ran 35-plus orderly food kitchens. Veterans patrolled in white armbands. As I mentioned, there was 0 violence and 0 arrests. Yet by week's end, the government's relentless fear campaign and refusal to negotiate wore down morale, and some unions cracked, voting to return. But Sunday's Union Record, which was a daily paper that was run by the Seattle Central Labor Council, so a labor daily that came out and was its own media source, it said the strike stands on Sunday. The strike committee held firm, proving that while state power could deploy armies, it couldn't break labor's spine overnight. This is something from what was called the American Plan, which was a volley by the Employers Association after the success of the strike to break the closed shop, as in there couldn't be industries where only union workers could work. So for Seattle labor, this 1919 strike wasn't an ending, it was a detonation. The backlash was brutal. There was a political crackdown. The Palmer raids of 1919 happened right after. So the sedition trials had already begun in 1917 that would have been deployed against Wobblies, but also other dissenters and people that were conscientious objectors of World War I. There were mass deportations of leftist and labor leaders. There was an economic downturn in the 1920s. So many of the shipping contracts were axed, and therefore many of the workers from those emerging unions in the shipyards were let go. In Centralia, in November of 1919, there was Wobblies lynched for defending their home. There was an open shop onslaught, as I mentioned. It's called the American Plan. There's a flyer from it, a crusade to break unions in Seattle and nationwide. And then Hansen decided to give up his mayorship. He rose as a political demagogue that was hoping to get the Republican nomination for the next election cycle, presidential one. And there would be a rise nationwide of nativism and xenophobia as embodied by the KKK rallies and nativist hysteria throughout the 1920s. Many folks forget that the resurgent Klan in the 1920s was actually centered in Indiana, and that there were rallies in downtown Seattle. There were hotbeds up in various counties throughout Washington. Labor still saw this as an accomplishment, not a defeat, and they proclaimed that labor is on the march. Here's some proof. There was a huge wave of workers in 1919, a huge strike wave. 350,000 steelworkers paralyzed mills coast to coast. There was a Winnipeg general strike in solidarity. Workers launched an even longer general strike weeks later. Seattle rebuilt. They organized a farmer labor party that launched in 1920 and tried to set up candidates as a slate for elections. And a big network of cooperatives started to build. So people were looking for labor alternatives, built union-owned stores and feeding workers. So the verdict was the state unleashed federal raids and the workers' first depressions and lynch mobs, yet they answered with party building, cooperative building, and continent-wide strikes. The legacy was pretty pronounced. Oh, and then I should also mention here, now in his introduction to the new edition of the Seattle General Strike, Robert Freidheim's professor of history at UW, Jim Gregory, reminds us in the updated edition that workers saw this general strike as their crowning accomplishment. Why? Because they proved something radical. Labor doesn't just work, it can govern. Their legacy exploded across 3 continents. I mentioned all those other things. Winnipeg's general strike, 350,000 steelworkers. There was also a huge nationwide strike wave. And then the Seattle general strike and its peaceful model influenced the San Francisco general strike at 34, Minneapolis 34, Oakland 46, and really looked at that. They also learned, I think that the planners of those strikes learned to constrain the duration of the strike so that it didn't kind of dwindle, right? So they learned something from that too. Seattle's Metal Trades Council became one of the predecessors for the CIO, proving workers win when they smash craft silos and unite industry across craft lines. And then there was an ambition for a cooperative commonwealth. So while bosses were screaming Bolshevik, Seattle built union-owned stores feeding families, the Farmer Labor Party, mutual aid networks that outlasted the strike. So when you see today's struggles, like Amazon warehouses, Starbucks stores, teacher strikes, remember every picket line stands on the shoulders of those who first showed workers can shut down a city and run it for better. Now, oh yes, right. I think I covered that. There were some limits to the solidarity that are really important to think about. There are brutal limits that were embedded in the deep and widespread aspects of white supremacy and sexism and other aspects of our culture that have deep roots, right? So once again, Japanese unionists got seats at the General Strike Committee meetings, but they didn't have voting power. Black workers faced near total exclusion from most AFL unions. Women were largely barred or relegated to segregated unions, though it's important to note that women did play an important leadership role on the General Strike Committee, and some of the component unions were in women-led industries. So it's important to think about, when by succumbing to that or allowing those divisions to obtain, it ultimately wound up playing into some of the divisions that were created by employers and lessen the power of those people that sought to create a general strike. Here are just some of the lessons. Basically, the idea of an injury, one injury at all. So by excluding workers, bosses exploited those cracks. There will be new divisions that different employers or different institutions try to create because your chain breaks at its weakest link. As I mentioned, white supremacy, sexism, and craft silos limited solidarity in 1919. And one other thing that's really an important lesson that workers can draw from this is, in solidarity with the general strike, the Seattle Union Record shut down its production for a few days. That allowed the mainstream press to yell that it was a revolution. So one other thing is, workers should continue controlling their own media during these kind of episodes. And one other thing to think about is that those general strike kitchens weren't just charity, but they were mutual aid bulwarks that really, I think, are good models for when we look at stuff now. Now, I'm just going to zoom through this. I want to make the point that many of these collections are actually in the Labor Archives of Washington, University of Washington Library Special Collections. You're invited to visit. Many of these are actually online as part of our Seattle General Strike exhibit. We got the Central Labor Council records, Washington State Federation of Labor, different labor councils, the Seattle Union Record business records. Harry Altu was the publisher of the paper. Friedheim's Seattle General Strike History, the Industrial Workers of the World Seattle Joint Branch Records, Industrial Workers of the World Photograph Collection, which is all online and was also an exhibit. We have the Centralia Prisoners Defense Committee records that relates to the strike aftermath. We've got a really interesting collection on industrial espionage and labor spies that were trying to break unionizing in the Bon Marché. Now, I just wanted to also tie this into the actual geography of the waterfront. So this is what the Skinner and Eddy shipyard looked like in 1919. Here's the site of it in 2011, and it's much unchanged there. And I kind of gave the address of where that is. We also have a digital collections portal where you can see many of these things digitized, and 2 online exhibits that relate to this, should you want to pursue that further. The next area of a lesson, let me just make sure I have enough time. It's getting a little tight. This one I'm going to try to go through a little bit more quickly. I've been trying to not talk too quickly, but I want to make sure I cover a range. So this is about cannery workers unionism. And cannery workers unionism really has a deep history, especially in the Filipino-American community in Seattle, but it also involves many other workers, including Asian American workers, and really tells the story of that immigrant community. Here are some of the collections that relate to this history at the special collections in the Labor Archives of Washington. I highlighted the ones that particularly relate to the story I'm going to highlight here. And here's the scholarship that's been done by scholars that really are more expert in this than I. I highlighted the ones that we are going to be talking about specifically. It's important to ground this history within the American Empire. So y'all may remember in the wake of the Spanish-American War, the Philippines became part of a U.S. possession. The U.S. then engaged in a prolonged war to fight an independence movement within the Philippines for self-rule. These are the different books that are within special collections that are celebrating the U.S. possession of the Philippines. Filipinos first arrived to these shores centuries earlier aboard Spanish galleons back in the 1700s, but a major wave of immigration we often talk about began later, it's directly tied to that colonial takeover. I mentioned the Spanish War in 1898. Filipino children in classrooms were taught the American teachers that they were Americans. They were shown an idealized vision of the American dream. Yet the reality on the ground was after centuries of Spanish colonial rule, they had created deep poverty and stark inequality, and under U.S. control, economic opportunities remained severely limited for most Filipinos. The promise of the American dream rang hollow against the backdrop of underdevelopment. So what happened? Facing this gap between promise and reality, poverty, lack of opportunity, many Filipinos felt they had no choice but to leave. They set out hoping to find a better future promised by the textbooks, but missing from their daily lives. This potent mix, colonial history, Americanization, and economic hardship, fueled the second major wave of Filipino immigration, starting significantly around 1906, but especially in the 1920s and 30s. Look closely at this man. He represents a generation of Filipino immigrants who arrived primarily in the 1920s and 1930s. By 1930, over 150,000 Filipinos had come, about 110,000 in Hawaii and 40,000 to the mainland U.S., mostly settling right here on the West Coast. Who were they? Well, this group included a mix of backgrounds, some married families, a smaller number of working-class women, students supported by the Philippine government, even a few self-funded students from wealthier families. The overwhelming majority were single, working-class men. Their legal status was unique because the Philippines was a U.S. colony. Filipinos were considered U.S. nationals, so this crucial distinction meant they were exempt from the harsh exclusion laws that had banned earlier waves of Chinese and Japanese workers, so they were the last major wave of Asian labor allowed into the U.S. at that time. Where did they work? Like generations of immigrant laborers before them, most found themselves in demanding manual jobs. They became a vital part of the West's extractive industries, many joining the grueling seasonal labor circuit following harvests in California agriculture, heading north to Oregon and Washington canneries, and journeying all the way up to Alaska fisheries you see pictured here. Others worked in domestic service. This image captures a defining reality for countless Filipino Americans in this era. Life meant constant movement and hard labor, part of a migratory stream flowing from field to cannery from California to Alaska. These were the Filipino Lascaros. Take a look at this image. It was an Lascaro crew, mostly Filipino-American men working right here, right there in Ketchikan, Alaska. Their story is part of a much larger one. For 150 years, fish processing and canning have been vital industries on the West Coast. Canned salmon and sardines from these shores fed miners during the California Gold Rush, and soon they were feeding people around the globe. Now, long before canneries existed, native communities had mastered fish preservation through drying, a practice thousands of years old. While canneries sprang up in Monterey Bay all the way up to Puget Sound in Alaska, many of these skilled native people became the first cannery workers' wage labor force. But the work was brutal, was seasonal, cold, wet, dirty, and dangerous, and paid very little. Unsurprisingly, local workers often avoided these jobs, and so the work fell to immigrants. First came European immigrants, Italians, Portuguese, and Norwegians, but in the Northwest, the workforce shifted overwhelmingly to Asian immigrants. First Chinese, then Japanese, and especially after 1920, Filipinos. These Filipino workers, often called the Lascaros because they worked in Alaska, like the men in this man in that photo, started arriving in 1911. Then in the 1920s, something crucial happened. The new U.S. immigration laws specifically barred many other Asian groups. Suddenly, Filipinos filled that void left by excluded Japanese and Chinese workers. They were hired through a notorious labor contractor system. Contractors were paid to deliver entire work crews, whole crews like that one, for the frantic summer season. They handled wages and expenses. Sounds simple? It was not. This system was riddled with abuse, corruption, bribery for jobs, favoritism, leading to horrific exploitation by both contractors and employers. No wonder it fueled a powerful drive towards unionism. The life outside of the cannery was just as harsh. These hopeful workers faced a deeply hostile environment. White communities often met them with violence and intimidation. Local police and laws systematically targeted Filipinos and other minorities. Employers played a cruel game. They deliberately divided workers by ethnicity and crushed union efforts, all to keep wages dirt cheap and maintain total control. The workforce itself was rigidly divided by race. White workers held the top, better-paid jobs. Minorities faced the worst conditions and the biggest hurdles, just like the Lascaros in that cannery floor photo. Then, the Great Depression hit in 1929. Imagine this, mass unemployment flooded the job market. Suddenly, everyone, citizen and immigrant alike, was desperately competing for the same scarce, grueling jobs. It made an already dire situation even worse. I'm going to go a little bit into the history of different affiliations, but one thing I wanted to point out is this piece of history, which is part of our collections. It's the meeting minutes from 1933 where Filipino cannery workers officially named their new organization the Filipino Labor Union. This document captures a pivotal moment, workers fighting back. Faced with a brutal exploitation that we just discussed, the contractor scams, the poverty wages, the dangerous conditions, the discrimination, Filipino workers didn't just endure, they organized. They built unions and mutual aid societies across the West Coast to protect themselves, demand better wages, and force change. From here in Seattle in 1933, cannery workers formed the Filipino Labor Union, documented in this very record, but their vision grew quickly. Soon they changed the name to the Cannery and Farm Laborers Union, Local 18257, affiliating with the powerful AFL. So this is one exception to that AFL rule that we were talking about. Their first major target was to smash that contractor system that had bled them dry. They did it through mass organizing. They wanted to bring everyone in the canneries and fields together to bargain collectively with employers. No more begging, no more contractors. Over the decades, this union became far more than a workplace advocate. It grew into a central pillar of the community, a weapon against injustice, a vehicle for civil rights, and relentless force for dignity on the job. It still exists today. It's now known as Region 37 of the Inland Boatmen's Union of the Pacific, affiliate with the ILWU. It continues the fight, representing cannery workers and protecting hard-won rights that from those that came before. Oh, and then this is a powerful image of when the Cannery Workers Union affiliated with the Congress of Industrial Organizations. That's the head of the ILWU at the time. At the time, Kerry Bridges was the head of the West Coast CIO. Later, they would affiliate with him. Okay, sure. I'm going to just zoom through this now because I just want to show you really quickly. So there's the charters, and if there's different affiliations. This is an important deportation campaign that happened between 1949 and 53. There was a series of arrests by the U.S. government. They tried to deport and detain different business agents of the union, not because of their politics as much as they claimed, but because they were effective organizers. This coincided with an organizing drive in Alaska canneries. There was a special meeting. There was a series of arrests that took these other folks in under the Internal Security Act of 1950, also known as the McCarran Act. They were hounded and detained. The Immigration Service failed to produce the parade of stool pigeons that they wanted, so some of these folks were let go. The union tried to document this history, hiring Carlos Bulosam, who's a Filipino-American poet and activist and organizer, to write their yearbook. This yearbook, which is digitized and on our website, talks about their struggle. They also equate their resistance to deportation to ILWU founding president Harry Bridges, who was also an immigrant who was attempted to be deported by the government. There was another wave. Then there was aftermath and a legacy, which was that some of them were freed by the High Court. There was a coalition of labor, left, and radicals that helped work together across ethnic and organizational lines to free these folks. And then there was a resurgence in the 1970s and 80s of an attempt to try to harken back to the rank and file movement within the same union. So inspired by African American construction workers, Alaska Cannery Workers Union association was created to do civil rights lawsuits around affirmative action. Silmy Domingo and Jean Viernes were elected as officers of the union as part of a rank and file movement. They documented the disparate labor conditions in Alaska canneries. And then they were assassinated in the Pioneer Square Area Hall in 1981. The legacy is remembered, and they actually wound up being vindicated by finding the Marcos regime in the Philippines complicit, and the U.S. government as well, in assassinating them for trying to oppose the Marcos regime. Their Union Hall still stands there today. This is the historic photo, and this is what it looks like now. We have an online exhibit about it relating to Carlos Bulosan. I know I tried to cram a lot of history in there. There's even better history, or, well, not better, but even as interesting history relating to the Ship Scalers Union. I invite you to look at it on the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project website. It's an amazing racially progressive union that also had a rank-and-file insurgents in the 70s and 80s that were then contested by their international union. These three lessons look at those regional rebellions that really harken back to the radical tradition and some of the different labor organizing modes to protect some of the most vulnerable workers in our region. Thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Connor. That was wonderful. I think we are going to be very strict here and have time for 2 audience questions. So really think it over with the Jeopardy music in your mind. Do I love my question? Will it be one of 2? And then you can raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes, it is. Okay. In regard to the Seattle general strike, it seems like the Wobblies were not officially involved. There may have been overlap, as you mentioned, by 2 cardists actively working in it. But the Wobblies didn't take an organizational role in the strike. Instead, the Central Labor Council was in charge. But the Central Labor Council seemed to be functioning as if it were the central organization of one big union. Yeah. So the methodology of the general strike and the operational strategy of the strike itself was modeled on Wobbly techniques, even though the Wobblies weren't actively officially involved. What's your comment?
A great observation, yeah. And in fact, I would say that perhaps that influx of those folks that were in the shipyards then influenced the policy of the Metal Trades Council, because they were doing that. They were also the biggest component of the Central Labor Council. There was also this interesting little maneuver that happened where there was a labor leader that was framed up in San Francisco, Tom Mooney, that was accused of bombing a Preparedness Day parade. While all the Seattle Central Labor Council brass were there at a Tom Mooney kind of solidarity organizing committee back east, some of the people that were a little bit more fringe people made a vote while they were out of town. So I think that you're right. There is some sort of cater stuff that was going on where people were organizing together. And I keep wondering about the exact relationship. We know that there is a very large membership. Kimmeldorf talks about this, and it's in the oral histories in our collection. We collected them and digitized and transcribed them from his book, Reds or Rackets. And it talks about how many ILA, the Longshore local members, were also IWW members at that time. It seems like that was also true in the shipyards, right? The Metal Trades Council. But it's not clear exactly how overtly those connections were, and yet some of those flyers that I put in there are actually from the IWW collection. They're leaflets that I think they sent out to propagandize people to make the Metal Trades Council go further. And it's important to think that those free speech fights they sometimes were about wobbly free speech, but like in Everett, they were going there to try to make the Shingle Weavers Union strike more radical. And so that's a great point. I don't exactly know this precise relationship between it, but it's a perennial question because they're super organized and very influential, and yet they're not trying to take over the strike, you know? But the general strike is their idea. They've been claiming it for years, right?
Hi, we have a question from our live stream. A viewer going by Superior Platypus has a question about the Everett Massacre.
Oh, yeah.
So they noticed that the inscription on the grave of the men killed in the Everett Massacre says it was, quote, erected by the Russian colony, and want to know who or what was the Russian colony in reference there.
Oh, that's interesting. Is that... I know that there's an inscription in Lakeview Cemetery and that many of the Everett Massacre victims are buried there, 4 of the 5. I don't remember that inscription. The Russian colony might refer to the Red Ark that was sent In 1919, after the Palmer raids, many of the IWW's leaders were deported to Russia, some of them who weren't Russian residents. Big Bill Haywood fled before then to escape government persecution. And so that may be what they're talking about, the Russian colony. I don't remember seeing that on the grave, though. Yeah, great question.
All right. I think with that, we're here at time. So thank you so much, Conor. Please give Conor a really nice round of applause. And this is our last History Cafe before summer break, so we'll be away for July and August, but come back September 17th for our next History Cafe. Looking forward to seeing you all there. On your way out, if you would like to help MoHi programming into the future, we have not sold in stores, one-of-a-kind, never-before-seen postcards that you can get if you take a survey. All right. Take care, everyone.